So one of the biggest challenges is really figuring out where do I start. The answer is pretty simple, right? We're going to collect the requirements, also known as deliverables for our project, and hopefully that gives us enough information to move on. A lot of organizations have formalized requirement and bid processes, and those are great. But sometimes, that great technical documentation that you get isn't totally in line with what the user actually experiences. So as a result, one of the things that we definitely encourage quite a bit is for you to spend time with your end user in their environment. This gives you a much better understanding of their workflow, of their environment, the devices they're using. Maybe they've got a lot of sunlight coming in through a window that makes certain colors really hard to see on a screen or something like that. That's kind of information that you may not get in a technical formalized requirement document. So definitely do what you can to get into their space. And if you can't be physically present, then organize a teleconference or maybe get some pictures of their environment. Even just a phone call can help shed a little bit of light and give you a more complete picture on what it is that the user is really going to benefit from. This extra information can actually help you deliver a better product, which may reduce the amount of rework you need to do or reduce the amount of problems that end up resulting in your application and having to come back and fix them later. So once you've got a fair understanding of the requirements of your project, it's time to start actually, figuring out what you're going to build. And this is really where we start coming into design. Wireframes don't need to be complex. You don't need fancy tools necessarily. A lot of times just putting some ideas on paper with a pencil will help you organize your thoughts and kind of figure out what possibilities are there and what's going to work best. So for example, here's an initial SketchUp for the new Vision project launcher with Ignition 8.0. At its lowest fidelity, we're able to work through a lot of simple design decisions and just figure out our kind of general layout. And then you can take that and take it a step further and create kind of a mock of your actual design. This is still technically what we call wireframe fidelity. From here, we know the structure that we want, and it's just a matter of adding the UI polish in order to bring it all the way to production quality. Once you got a wireframe, it's time to actually start figuring out how you're going to build the project from a technical perspective. And here again, a little planning up front can save you a lot of time in the long run. So what should your project look like? There's really no best way to structure a project, but one thing that we do suggest is in leveraging Ignition 8's project inheritance. And so if you're unaware, project inheritance is a new feature, and it allows us to basically combine projects by inheriting the resources of another project. In our image here on the left, we've got project A where I've created some templates. Project A is inheritable, meaning any other project that I want to use those resources can inherit those resources. So if we look, we got project B that doesn't have any templates, but simply by setting B to inherit project A, now project B has all of those templates available to it. And beyond that, project B can not only just use those templates, but if project B has a special need, it can actually override those templates with its own version. Previously, you could kind of accomplish this by exporting your resources or your projects, but if anybody has done that, it becomes pretty painful as your organization grows or your changes start happening more rapidly. In this system, you basically make the changes once in one place, and all your projects simply inherit the improvement. It's a lot less overhead to manage. This also lets us do things like, if I'm a big organization, I might want a UI design team that's focused just on component development that everybody else can use. So it's pretty neat that I could create a team and they work on one project all the time, building out great components, and every other team in the organization can use that same component library. So the entire organization has the same look, feel, and consistency across their projects. And then finally, last step, Ray kind of already mentioned this, but we always recommend creating a design system instead of just creating a single page or a single design. Remember, design systems they're just a collection of visual guidelines. They can be large and complex, but they don't need to be, and they almost never start that way. So start simple and build it up when it makes sense. All right, so starting our project, that's what we're going to be doing today, and we're going to take our own advice and walk through some of these steps, and we'll do it by essentially putting together our own design system in perspective. And we'll build some responsive screens along the way and kind of give you some examples. For me, I've already got a lot of user feedback because we hear what you guys want to see quite a bit. So I can check that one off the list. Wireframe design, so I've got that checked off. And then project inheritance. So to start my actual project, all I'm going to do is create two separate projects. One is going to be a component project that's going to act as my component library, and it'll be an inheritable project. And the other is going to be what I'm going to call my design project, which is where my design system is. Project inheritance, check. And design system is what we're going to be building, so we're going to have to save that last checkbox. So with the design system, the question arises, what should we put into it? You don't need to be complex. These are some pretty complex examples here. Don't try to do that. Certainly not to start. To start off, just keep it simple. Start with some colors, maybe your company's brand colors and some action colors. And even then, if you want to get a little bit more advanced later, do that. So just like this example that we're kind of working off, add some typefaces, some styling for different elements of text. And then from there, if you need to get more technical and get larger, you can certainly do so. But don't be intimidated and feel like you got to start there. So again, we're kind of following our own advice. We're just going to pick an element from here in order to start building it out. And specifically, I'm going to start with this row of base colors. So these are base colors. The term base may not be familiar to you if you're a new designer, but base colors are just something that we use in designs where we want to create a sense of depth or maybe differentiation between different elements. For instance, if we've got a header of a table that we think needs to look distinct from the rows beneath it, we might use colors from the scales to denote that difference. And having a defined base gradient like this that's shared across components is a great way to achieve some cohesion in your designs. So if you look at the row of base colors here, you notice that each color swatch is the same shape, same size. They just have different values presented, right? Anytime we kind of see something like this, we should ask ourselves, hey, is this an opportunity for breaking down this design into reusable parts? I've got 7 color swatches. There's a good chance I'm going to want to add more later, so I think it makes sense to invest a little time into abstracting this into a single reusable component. So let's start there. Here I am. I've opened up the designer and I'm in my component library project. If I look at the project resource tree, I can see that I've got 2 new resources that Perspective provides, styles and views. Styles are a resource that we can leverage to apply design styling in a very performant way. If you're familiar with CSS, you've got any sort of web development background, styles are effectively CSS classes. We're going to talk about those a lot more. Now, views are what hold our components, and they do so through the use of what we call containers. The primary tool of organizing your components on your screen is the container, and that's basically how we achieve our layout designs and our responsive designs. A view gets exactly 1 root container, and that root container determines really how all the immediate children of the view are organized. But containers themselves are just special components, so you can combine them, you can nest them. And what's really neat about views is that they too can be used just like components in other views, meaning that we can take a view, we can add some components to it that serve some group purpose, and then we can basically use that everywhere. So we call views that are kind of set up to do that template views. We're going to start building a color swatch template view. All right, so getting started with our template view, we're going to right-click in the designer and the views, and we're going to create a new view. And right away, we're presented with this configuration panel here. If we focus just on the layout options for now, there's 5 of them. We're going to make use of some of them today to better understand how it impacts our design. But with 5 options, you kind of have to ask, what should I choose? What makes sense? And like many things when it comes to design, there isn't a best choice for a blanket answer. It's really going to depend on the content and the context that you're working in. They all kind of serve different purposes. They have different benefits. Given that most of us are familiar with coordinate style layouts, we'll start there. And that makes sense for this component because we're not looking to have any responsiveness for our color swatch. So I choose coordinate, create the view, and I've got an empty view in my workspace. All I have is an empty canvas here, so where do we start with? Well, looking at the element that we want to create, I basically have 3 things that I'm worried about. The color up on top, and then I've got these 2 labels down below. So the color up on top, there's a lot of things that I can use for that. I'm just going to choose a label because I know that I can remove the text from a label and I can color the background, piece of cake. So to actually make this, all I need to do is resize my view to a reasonable size. I grab one of our labels off of our palette of components, kind of get some initial sizing done, and then I can use the control if you're on Windows or Command on Mac plus Shift and then drag, and that lets me basically duplicate any component and keep it in the same line, whether it be horizontal or vertical. So I created my 3 labels here, resized it, and so this is kind of basically it for now, right? So where do we go from here? How do we make this actually usable by other components in any meaningful way? How do we turn it into that template view? Well, the answer really lies in bindings and parameters. So if you're new to the Ignition platform, the term binding is just a mechanism for associating data between 2 elements. Those elements might be component properties, there might be a tag or a tag value in a component. We'll see how that works here in just a moment. For now, we're going to set up our views parameters. So parameters are essentially the way that you get data in and out of one of these template views. So to create my parameters, if I select the view in the project tree like we have here, see on the right, the perspective property editor responds by showing you the properties available to the current selected thing. And views have parameters. To add a new parameter, I simply click that little blue plus, and you can type in whatever values you want. So in our case, our color swatch, we've really got three things. We've got a color, and then we've got two labels. But the actual color itself and one of those labels are being driven by the same data. So for my parameters, I just create two of them. One that holds the name of the color, the other that holds the code. And I've given them some default values here. So when we drop it onto a screen, we can have something there that isn't just random text or nothing. So with our parameters now set, now we got to do our binding. And so that's what basically we see happening here is I'm going to come in here and to create, for instance, the color swatch up top, I delete the text, and then I use a style property. So there's two different ways that you can really style components, at least two primary ways. There's style classes, and then there's style properties. So style classes are that resource I mentioned at first that you can create just like you create a view. Style properties are properties that apply only to a specific component. That's what we're going to use here right now. So to add a style property, all we do is create a new key and value in the style section of our component props, and we just type in what we want. If you don't know exactly what you want, you can create or click the little icon that's to the right of the word style, and it'll pick a little helper up, and so that'll kind of guide you through some of the things that are available to you. Once we got our properties set, you can see what's happening in the image. The next thing to do is set up the actual binding. And to do that, all we do is click in the gutter just to the left of the property we're interested in binding. You can see right here there's a little icon. So clicking that brings up the binding configuration panel. And once our binding configuration panel picks up, we're looking to bind properties. So we want our view parameter property to provide the value and to send it into the place where we're binding it to. In this case, it's the background color. So we're going to choose the property binding from that little editor when it pops up, and then we can use the helper that we'll see again here in just a moment in order to find the path to the actual property we want to bind to. So here we are, we're finding the property we want to bind to, which is one of our parameters. Click color code, accept it. Our values are now being driven by that parameter. And that was it to making our template view. So we basically use a container to figure out how the view's layout is going to work. We use parameters to send data to and from the views, and then we can use bindings to connect the data between the parameters and the actual component properties. So let's move on and figure out how we might use this template color swatch to build our first view in our designer project. So again, that was in our component project, which is our inheritable project, and now we're going to move over to the designer project. And just as a reminder for what we're looking for here, we're going to try and replicate this row of base colors. So similar process. Basically what I did is I created a new view and I sized it approximately what I think it should be. And then you'll notice that the component that actually gets pulled off of the palette here is not the color swatch component. What it is the embedded view component. So embedded views are a way of basically calling another view and using it as a component. And all embedded views take a couple properties. One of them is a path, which is what just got configured there, and that's a path to the view that you're interested in presenting. Because we inherited that template view, it shows up in our project resource tree, just like a local resource, so we can choose it. And then the other thing that we configure with that is this params array. So you can see there that once we get that embedded view on there, it shows right up with the default white that we had set previously. So to give the color and the name we want, since we've got our bindings set up and our parameters set up, all we need to do is configure the parameters for this particular template. So here I'm just adding to this params property those two parameters, and because they're already bound, if I type in color name and add something in there, it ends up being applied to the label and also to the background color. After we've got one of these up, we can just make copies of our embedded view, update the parameters, and this is what our result is. we can actually look at this in the designer and then also in the browser and see how they look. And here in the browser, it looks exactly as it did in the designer. But since we're here to learn about mobile responsive design, let's see what happens when we take this and we put the browser into responsive mode. And so to do that, you just open up the development tools in your browser. In this case, we're using Chrome. And in Chrome, there's this button up at the top left that I've highlighted in red. And if you click that, it'll take you to a slightly different view of your browser. And it provides these new little bars that you can grab onto in order to change the size. And what we see right here is, unfortunately, our coordinate container that we picked is kind of letting us down. As our screen size shrinks, our content doesn't respond at all. Instead, we just get a scroll bar. Scrolling, especially horizontal scrolling, is just not a good experience on mobile. So let's take another look at a container that we could have used that might naturally behave a little bit better as our screen size shrinks. This is where we're really starting to think about responsive and not just simple coordinate organization. So this time we're going to choose a different container, and that's going to be the Flex container. So when you add a component to the Flex container, it uses something called CSS Flexbox. So Flexbox, if you're not familiar with it, don't worry. I'll just say that Flexbox itself is really pretty simple. It lets you put items into rows or columns. You can choose one or the other, and it just treats each item as a box. And then you can configure how each of those boxes actually reacts to the environment. So you can align them to the left, you can align them to the right, you can justify them in different ways. You can tell that these boxes spread apart or stick together. In addition, you can also tell the items whether they should grow or shrink or maybe wrap if the space available to them changes. So here, these animations here are just a couple of the options available to you. Flex containers are really kind of a good way to get a mobile-first design, at least to get started. So this image here, basically, we're seeing the same layout, right? It looks identical to the coordinate. The main difference is, if we look at the coordinate version, we've got up here, you see a little XY where the container is. It might be hard to read on your screen. It's a little hard to read for me. But in your designer, typically you can differentiate that from this one, which is kind of got these little boxes. So that's hint number one, that our container type's different. The other thing that I noticed is that over here on the right, our properties are different from a coordinate container. A coordinate container doesn't have a direction, it doesn't wrap, it doesn't justify. And so those are kind of two things that you can really quickly at a glance determine what kind of container is on the current view that you're working with. So how does this one work on mobile? This is actually a much better experience. As your screen real estate gets smaller, it just kind of starts to wrap around. And the great thing about this is that the amount of work that it took to create this, given the same starting point, is actually less than it takes for the coordinate layouts. I don't need to worry about moving our components on the view and placing them where I want. I just put them there, and then the Flex container will align them, based on a couple settings that I set. So the main thing, I guess, to take away from this is really just how important container types are. Choosing a more responsive container doesn't necessarily result in more work up front, but there's a high likelihood that if you choose the wrong one, you're going to end up with some work because people are going to want a better experience on mobile. So take some time, play with all the different containers, get a little bit of a feel for how they work, and then choose the best one depending on your specific goals. Well, just as a reminder, tiny tweaks is basically stylistic changes to the same content, and by content I'm just meaning the text on the screen, the images and stuff like that, and of course the same layout. So we're not changing the structure of the page at all. We're just changing the way that certain stylistic parts appear. Like Ray mentioned, we're talking about text size and maybe your font changing or the padding around elements changing, borders, highlights, that sort of thing. Tiny tweaks are something that's actually pretty easy to do and can be very powerful in the right setting. We're going to try and replicate some different text types, right? So it's pretty common in any application to have something like we see here, where we've got headers that are kind of differentiated, different sections of our page. We might have our standard paragraph text and more specialized text types, right? Like labels. Here I've got this one called equipment label. So taking a little bit of a closer look, this is what we're going to try to replicate. And so essentially we've got two different columns of text. Style classes are a great way to achieve stylistic differentiation and reusable styling in your project. And so on the left, we've basically got an example of what the text looks like. And on the right, we've got the name of the style class that we've created to create that appearance. So let's see how we can leverage style classes to accomplish our tiny tweaks. So as I did last time, kind of the same thing. I asked myself, hey, can I make something reusable to save myself future work? There's a good chance that we're going to add more text in the future, and sure is nice having that component where all I have to do is provide it the parameters, and it changes to be what I want. So the answer is kind of a clear yes. So in our case, we basically deal with each text item is just two labels in a row. So rather than worry about creating them and aligning them for each row, I'm just going to make a single component, just like I did with the swatches. And then I can use that anytime I need it. I'm going to skip past kind of the nuts and bolts of creating my component because the process is basically the same. There's just a couple implementation differences. The first one is that our container has an icon next to it. This is not the XY in here, so I'm actually using a flex container. A coordinate container could work here, but I chose flex because we're looking to probably change the style of this, which means that I might want the size of my component to actually respond to the environment or to the content. If I were to choose a coordinate container, there's a chance that I could end up with scroll bars if, for instance, my header text is too big. The second difference is a little bit different in that I'm just going to use a different model for how I create my parameters. So in the previous one that we did, which is here on the right, we created two different parameters because we had two different values we're trying to send in. In this example, instead of creating two different parameters, I just created one. Using deeper nesting in parameters like this versus using independent parameters like this is really kind of a judgment call. A single object parameter can make for a little bit cleaner configuration in some cases. It's also a very natural fit if you've got UDTs, for instance, which are user-defined data types. If you've got a very clear match for your template view, creating this object style parameter can accept the whole UDT value. It just really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. The downside of this deeper nesting is really that it can become a little bit more monotonous to try and find those sub values in scripting or when building data objects in the property editor. It may also not be quite as clear to your users that are trying to configure these things, but it gets a little bit of experience with those and figure out what works for you. I'm going to use a transform here. And so a transform is something in perspective that occurs in bindings. When you bind something, you would just basically get that raw value and no real direct way to change it before it arrives at the destination, meaning the property we're actually trying to apply that to. Transforms are really neat. They will basically intercept the value that's coming in via our view parameter and let you modify that value before it arrives at its destination. Common uses could be, something like mapping an integer to a color code, for instance. Another thing could be running maybe some text through a localization script or something like that. There's a lot of uses for them, and what's really neat about them is that they can actually be chained. One of the biggest limiting things that we find with designs and the time it takes to implement new designs is really in trying to get that data to your component in a way that's usable by the component. Here with transforms, if you're familiar with Vision, you used to maybe use a client tag, and you would take your binding and write it this client tag, and then you would have some change script or something like that changed the values on that client tag, and then you had another tag or another property somewhere that was actually listening to that one. It was a little bit challenging. This is a much more direct model, and it's performant, and it's super clean and easy to understand. So my transform is really pretty simple. One of the parameters that we created in our text settings object was an array called classes. And so classes in a regular component are something that we use in order to add our style classes to our component. I don't want to present text that's an array. I just want basically, a single string that I can add as my style class name in the event that I have multiple classes applied to my component. All I'm doing here is I'm basically taking that array and I'm just joining all of the elements of my classes array into a single string. And so this is kind of what that looks like as it's configured. All right, so that was basically putting together our little example text component, right? We've got the example text on the left with this default value, and then we're going to have the name or names if we've got multiple, because we are using that array that's transformed into a single string, or we'll have one or more style names on the right. So now back in my designer project, I'm going to create a new embedded view in order to use this. But instead of using an embedded view that is static, I'm going to choose a flex repeater component to hold my embedded view. Flex repeaters are really pretty neat because they allow us to be flexible in what we present. It lets you basically pick the path of the component or view, that you want to represent. And then the number of times that shows up is totally dynamic. And it's dynamic based on how many entries you have in this instances array. And so that's kind of what we're demonstrating here. As you can see dynamically, as I add a new element to our instances array, I'm not even adding any values, I'm just adding a new empty object. But for each one I add, it creates a new instance of my view. And so the way that this works is that if those values in that array happen to be parameters, or happen to be named the same as your parameters, the view essentially is provided those values as its parameters, and that's how we basically get our dynamic values. So we've got now this flex repeater in our dynamic repeating view, but currently it's just showing our default values. So let's start getting them styled and start getting them populated with some actual values we care about. So we're going to create some style classes, and we're going to add them to our instance configurations. So style classes are those style resources that we talked about right up above here, above views. And all style classes have names. And so I'm going to choose, for basically all of my text style classes, some consistency, because I want them to be recognizable and easy to identify. So I'm starting all of them with the word text, and then underscore, and then, the type of text that they are. And then at the end, I'm just appending maybe dark or light. Dark being my text is dark, so it's the kind of thing that I want to use in a light background. And maybe I might want a light version if my text is light, and that would be the kind of thing that I would use on a dark background. And so after creating and naming my style, I get this little style helper that pops up. Now all I need to do is basically add the styles that I want to apply to my class. So in this case, I'm starting with my header. I just want it to be a little bit bigger. And so I set the font size, click OK, and I've got my my style created. So in doing that there, what I basically have done, you'll notice over here on the left, is I've created my base style. So base style is something that basically applies that style to my component, regardless of the situation, assuming that I have no further style rules applied. And so a style rule is basically a way to get some additional dynamic functionality out of your style. And that is actually how we're going to start accomplishing our tiny tweaks. So if I click that style rule, the little plus button next to style rules, I'm presented with two options, element state or media query. So element states represent something in CSS known as a pseudo selector, and they're a way of styling an element in pure CSS so that it can respond to environmental things such as mouse hovers or maybe the component being focused. They're a lot of fun to use, but right now we're more interested in responsive design, so we're going to look at media queries. Media queries are kind of similar, except their focus is more on configuring styling behavior based on things such as screen size or aspect ratio or orientation on the page. So if I choose media query, you can see I've got a new style rule that's created over here, and I've got this new option up at the top. And there are a number of different things that I can pick from there, but the one that we're interested in right now is min width. And the way that that works is that essentially when my min width is surpassed, whatever styles that I've created for that particular rule will be applied. And so you can see here that we're still working on our H1 text style. And we've chosen a min width of 480 pixels, which is typically a decent starting point for something like a mobile phone. And then we're just applying a little bit more margin to our component when we get to mobile. So if I save this and I apply it to the component by adding it to our style classes array, and then I open that in the browser, you can see right here, we have a whole bunch of reactivity to our size growing. And that's exactly what we were looking to accomplish. When it gets wider than 480 pixels, we get a lot more padding, and that's going to make it a lot easier for somebody on a desktop screen to view because, on mobile, the phone's close to you. You don't need quite so much space between elements because it's right there. It's very sharp typically, and beyond that, you don't have a whole lot of real estate. The desktop, a little bit different environment. Screens tend to be further away. They tend to be lower resolution. And so having a little bit more space between elements can really aid readability. So that was really what we're trying to accomplish here.